2023. I hope everyone had a good rest. Not like for some of us here, we had too much to eat, and now we lack of sleep, as you can see, right? Walid, I think Walid and a few others, right? But as I said to the audience yesterday, for those of you who missed coming physically, wish you were here, right? Now, good morning once again to everyone. Today, we are going to start off really strong and really good. Give me 1 second to get my notes out because I have a special request. Now, this morning, we are going to start off with a very interesting keynote. I will say interesting because it's from my friend. And I do not need too much introduction, but for the sake of those who do not know him, let me read out his introduction. This morning's keynote is by Professor James Chin from the University of Tasmania. He's a professor of Asian Studies, and he's also a senior fellow at Jeffrey Chia Institute. He was the inaugural director of Asia Institute Tasmania and the founding head of the School of Arts and Social Sciences at Monash, Malaysia. James is a leading scholar on Malaysian politics and has published extensively on political developments in Sabah and Sarawak. His most recent publication is a special issue of the Roundtable on Singapore's transition to the fourth generation leadership under Lawrence Wong. He also co-edited with Benjamin Loh a book entitled New Media in the Margins, Lived Realities and Experiences from the Malaysian Peripheries, published by Paul Grave earlier this year. James is currently writing on the Chinese community in Papua New Guinea. Now, on top of his academic work, James writes regularly for the media, and his commentaries have appeared in the New York Times, The Australian, the South China Morning Post, New Straits Times, and CNA. James holds undergraduate degrees from the University of Adelaide and the University of Sydney in Australia, and a PhD from Victoria University of Wellington. Now, James tells me that he is planning to retire soon, which I doubt, and settle back in Kuching, his hometown. Now, without much further ado, let's put our hands together for James for his keynote speech.
Thank you very much, Jason, for your kind introduction. I'll start off by thanking New Era College and MASSA for the kind invitation to talk to you this morning. So this morning, I've been asked to talk about the rise of East Malaysia, or Sabah and Sarawak, and I'll try to finish in about half an hour, so we will have plenty of time to discuss my presentation. Right, so basically my presentation will be split into 4 separate parts. The first, obviously, is something that is quite well known, but I thought it's important to provide a summary, and that is the reasons why Sabahans and Sarawakians are quite unhappy in the Federation of Malaysia. Then I'll talk about the present situation, and of course, the 2 most important parts are what do the people of Sabah and Sarawak want, and of course, the political implications. Right, so let's quickly go through some of the key reasons why there is a lot of unhappiness in Sabah and Sarawak. I'm sure you all heard of the Malaysia Agreement. That seems to be the lightning rod for a lot of the unhappiness expressed by the peoples of Sabah and Sarawak. So what are the sort of the big key items that they're not very happy with? I think if you were to speak to the chartering class in Sabah and Sarawak, the first thing they would tell you is that many believe that back in 1962-63, the majorities of Sabahans and Sarawakians were not really consulted properly on the formation of the Federation of Malaysia. It was obvious that we were living in a separate time. Many of those people in Sabah and Sarawak were probably not educated. The native population were definitely not consulted. Basically, they were told that this was what the colonial government, the Kerajaan, the government wanted, and they just went along with it. The other sort of thing that they're very unhappy about is that their understanding of the formation of the Federation of Malaysia was that Sabah and Sarawak were regarded as one of the 3 equal entities that established the Federation. But they always felt that from this side, the people from this side has always regarded Sabah and Sarawak as merely one of the 13 states. So that's the reason why if you go to Sabah and Sarawak, people keep talking about one of 3. what they mean is one of the three equal parts in the Federation of Malaysia. And of course, the other thing they're very, very unhappy about is that every year during 31st of August, they always think that the people on this side can't get the dates right. The Federation of Malaysia, of course, was established in '63, but somehow on this side, people keep counting the independence from '57. So every year you have two separate numbers, right? On this side, for example, you will say it's 56. On Sabah and Sarawak side, they'll insist it's 50. And of course, we know that from the federal government side, they've tried to resolve this issue by having another celebration in September called Malaysia Day. The other unhappiness expressed in historical terms is, of course, the separation of Singapore. This one definitely, if you look back at the historical papers, the archives, it was quite clear that the secret negotiations for the separation of Singapore actually occurred 1 year before the formal separation, and that very, very few people knew about it. Even a lot of the political elites on this side were also not consulted. But for Sabahans and Sarawakians, they are especially unhappy about this issue because they felt, as the founding members of the Federation, they should have been consulted by Tunku when Singapore wanted to get out of the Federation. So they have expressed unhappiness on this issue. So I'll quickly go through the other items. The other items are much more straightforward. Their understanding of establishing the Federation of Malaysia, of course, was that they will get lots of autonomy, and the basic feeling on the other side is that that has not been kept. Even on the biggest issue, the issue of immigration, they felt that that has not really been properly enforced, especially for the state of Sabah. In terms of development, they were promised that the federal government will do its best to bring up the development of Sabah and Sarawak to be on par with Malaya. Of course, that never happened. If you go to the interiors of Sabah and Sarawak, you can see that very little development has taken place in the last 50 years. The other thing that they're very, very angry about is, of course, natural resources. And here I'm basically referring to the oil and gas resources. In Sabah and Sarawak, they refer to this controversy as the PDA 1974, where all the oil and gas resources of Sabah and Sarawak were transferred to Petronas. Again, the argument is that this should not have happened because Sabah and Sarawak was so underdeveloped. How can you give the entire oil and gas resources to the federal government and receive only 5% back? And that 5% is obviously not enough to develop states. You all know, right? Sarawak is the largest state in the Federation, and that if you go to the interiors of Sarawak, there are many parts of Sarawak that has no roads. A simple example of that, in one of the big tourist attractions in Sarawak is a place called Barrio. You can't actually drive up the Barrio. Okay? The other thing that annoys them in terms of the Federation is, of course, this need to export the Malayan political model to East Malaysia. And here, of course, I'm referring to the Malay Islamic first policy on this side, the Kotana Melayu Islam approach. They're trying to shove this down to the throats of the Sabahans and Sarawakians. So that has created a lot of problems, especially in Sarawak. And of course, linked to this is the interference in domestic state politics. So for example, we know that in 1970, it was the federal government who intervened that created the 1970 coalition government in Sarawak. If the federal government had not intervened, the outcome would have been very different. In Sabah, the federal government has intervened from day one. The most famous intervention was, of course, when they tried to get rid of PBS. In 75, when they removed Mustafa from power and brought in Fuad Stevens. All this is very obvious to the people of Sabah, where Malayan political leaders have decided to not only change the character of the state politics, but to actually pick and choose who is the chief minister of both states. In Sabah, you have an additional problem, which is not in Sarawak, and that is democratic change. A lot of Sabahans will tell you that Sabah is now changed completely because of Project IC. Some people call it Project M, and of course M stands for Mahathir. And this has completely changed the character of Sabah, not only changed the entire demographic situation in Sabah, but actually changed the political structure in Sabah. Sabah is now a Muslim majority state. So the biggest native grouping in Sabah are no longer the most important component of the electoral system. Is actually the Muslims in Sabah. And of course, among the non-Muslim Bumiputra in Sabah in Sarawak, they always complain that they are regarded as third-class Bumiputra. First-class Bumiputra are Malay Muslims. Second class are those with strong cables, and they end up as the third class. They haven't received any benefits, despite the fact that they're officially classified as Bumiputra. So why now? Why are we seeing a rise of this issue of Sabahans and Sarawakians expressing their unhappiness? Actually, this issue is actually not new. It has been around for a very, very long time. It's just that in the old days, in the good old days, you don't have social media. Those people unhappy about this were not able to broadcast their unhappiness to the rest of the world. They were not able to come together to organize and talk about this issue. So it's actually been around for a very, very long time. If you go back even to the late 60s, right, you always had this feeling that maybe the federation doesn't fit us. Parties like the Sarawak National Party were openly expressing this even in the late 1960s. But the reason why it became a really, really hot political issue and became a real issue for the federal government was in 2008, the general elections, Barisan Nasional, even though it managed to hang on to power, it could only stay in power because of the number of MPs from Sabah and Sarawak. Without the Barisan Nasional MPs from Sabah and Sarawak, the government would have fallen. So that's the reason why immediately after that, Najib declared Malaysia Day as a holiday. He created a special Malaysia Agreement 63 cabinet level committee to deal with the grievances. Plus, he made a lot of key appointments. So, for example, Najib, for the very first time in Malaysia's political history, appointed the speakers and the two deputy speakers in the Dewan Rakyat, all from Sabah and Sarawak. Okay? It was also this time that the people of Sabah and Sarawak realized that the UMNO or the Barisan Nasional on this side really rely on them to stay in power. So they also start playing up the issue of state nationalism. So the most obvious example was Adnan Satem. He used it very, very successfully in the state elections in Sarawak. And of course, Jeffrey Kitingang used it very successfully in Sabah as well. And of course, it was also this period that they tried to push for constitutional amendment. So basically, the constitutional amendment is that they wanted under Article 1, they wanted the word Sabah and Sarawak to be on a separate line. They do not want Sabah and Sarawak to be lumped together with all the other states in Malaya. So they were pushing for it. So that's why it became a very big issue. And so that's the reason why on this side, everyone has heard of Malaysia Agreement. So let's quickly look at what did Sabah and Sarawak gain in the past decade after all this talk, controversy, on top of the political agenda. So I think you can look at it from various ways, but I just want to go through with you on what I think are the key outcomes or the key things gained by Sabah and Sarawak. The first, obviously, is that we have sort of a new political narrative on this side. So people no longer talk about Sabah and Sarawak as the fixed deposit. In the old days, the Barisan Nasional leadership or the UMNO leadership always worked the assumption that people in Sabah and Sarawak will always vote for Barisan, and we can always depend on the MPs from Sabah and Sarawak as a big block, a solid block together, UMNO here, and we will control the government. So that is no longer the case. So nobody talks about Sabah and Sarawak as fixed deposit anymore. Rather, the language has changed. Now they call the MPs from Sabah and Sarawak the kingmakers. And also in terms of administratively, the federal government has actually issued a circular that says that you should not call Sabah and Sarawak states negeri, you should call it wilaya. So it's very symbolic. Secondly, of course, there's been a lot more appointments at the federal level, cabinet level appointments, ministers and deputy ministers. And as I mentioned earlier, in all the governments since 2008, they've always set up MA cabinet level committee. And you can also see a lot of Sarawakians were given senior positions in the bureaucracy. This part has often not been advertised, but I personally know of quite a number of Sarawakians who will offer quite senior positions in the federal bureaucracy. And of course, in order to keep the people happy, remember I talked about Sabah and Sarawak being underdeveloped. Certainly, the idea of a Borneo highway, which was first which was first, first asked for in the late 1960s, suddenly came back, and now the federal government has decided to fund the entire federal highway. So the federal highway will actually be a proper highway like the North-South way, and you will connect Kuching all the way up to Sabah. Of course, you have to pass through Brunei, but they're building alternative road. But basically, the idea is that it is now possible, well, at least when it's completed, it is possible to drive on a very good road, highway quality, all the way from Kuching all the way up to KK. Okay? Now, in terms of constitution amendment, there were two attempts. The first one did not work. The first one under V.K. Liu from Warisan, under the Pakatan Harapan, that one did not work. But the most recent one worked in 2022 under GPS Minister Wan Junaidi, who's now the Senate President. He managed to push through the constitutional amendment, which specifically named the Malaysia Agreement. Now, this is very, very crucial, because one of the problems with trying to negotiate on the Malaysia Agreement was that prior to this amendment, the Malaysia Agreement was actually not named in the Malaysian Constitution. The Malaysian Constitution actually referred to the 1957 Malayan Constitution. But now, once this Constitution was passed, the Malaysia Agreement is actually mentioned in this amendment. So therefore, if you go to court dealing with the Malaysian Constitution and the rights of Sabah and Sarawak, you can actually refer to the Malaysian Agreement, especially to the IGC report, which provides the details of the rights of Sabah and Sarawak in the new Malaysian Federation. The other thing in terms of change in thinking, I think, is that if you speak to the Malay leaders on this side, you will see that a lot of them refer to Sabah and Sarawak groupings now. They look towards Sabah and Sarawak as part of the numbers game. Now, you all know, right? Nobody actually won the general election last year. So when they formed the government together, the first group that everyone was trying to court was, of course, GPS. So if you remember the sequence, right, GPS initially wanted to form a government with Muhyiddin. Then for a specific set of reasons, they suddenly changed their mind and decided to support to Anwar. The moment they switched to Anwar, everybody understood that the game was finished, that obviously Anwar was going to form the government. So in terms of the numbers game, I think it's very important. This is a very important mindset among the Malay political elites on this side. I think there's also, in the last 10 years, I think you also find that on this side, there's a lot of interest about how the Federation was established, especially the role played by Sabah and Sarawak. Because if you go through the Malaysian school system, if you look at the sejarah being taught in Tingkatan 4 and 5, very little is written about the role of Sabah and Sarawak, or they downplay the role. But I think there's a lot of interest nowadays among the younger people about how the Federation actually came together. And of course, related to this is that the natives of Sabah and Sarawak, which used to have a very, very low profile, now have a much higher profile. Because, for example, things like the Allah case issue. You all know, right? The Allah case issue actually originated from Sarawak. Sarawak Malana, Christian Malana wanted to bring in some Bibles and, started this Allah debate, okay? And also, I think the people from Sabah and Sarawak actually is a very strong reminder that, what old Malaysia was like, that you really have a place where multiculturalism actually works in practice. And of course, the final thing is that there's a much stronger Sarawakian and Sabahan identity out there today after all these issues about historical grievances, and they're actually speaking out about it. So just now I mentioned that that because of the strength of Sabah and Sarawak in helping to form the government on this side, the political leaders of this side are forced to appoint more people into the cabinet. So let me quickly show you the cabinet list, the latest one. This is the Anwar Ibrahim's cabinet, right? So you can see for the very first time in Malaysia's political history, Sarawakian was appointed Deputy Prime Minister. They were actually expecting him to be DPM1, but unfortunately he ended up as DPM2. But still, he's still a Deputy Prime Minister, Fadilah, and you had 4 full federal ministers on top of the Deputy Prime Minister's post. So that is 5 federal ministers in the cabinet, plus 2 from Sabah. So you can see, right, out of a 28-member cabinet, Sabah and Sarawak constitute 25%. So that's a large chunk, that's a large chunk. It's even bigger representation at the deputy cabinet level. So you can see from Sarawak, you have 6 deputy ministers, and from Sabah, because they only had 2 full ministers, they ended up with 7 deputy ministers. So altogether, 13 deputy ministers, and they constitute almost half of the cohort of deputy federal ministers in the cabinet. So you can imagine, right, this is quite remarkable. 2 states holding 25% of full cabinet positions and almost half of the deputy cabinet positions in Malaysia. So let me quickly move on to what do Sabahans and Sarawakians want. Top of the list at the present moment is that they want 1/3 of the seats in parliament. I need to explain to you how this number came about. Basically, due to the way the Federation of Malaysia was established, if you remember your history, so the idea was that they did not want to give Malaya total power. In order to change the Malaysian constitution, you need 2/3 majority. So to stop Malaya having this power, originally back in 1963, they made sure that Singapore, Sabah and Sarawak had more than 1/3 of the seats. Therefore, Malaya was not in a position to make any amendments to the federal constitution. Now, what happened was that 2 years later in 1965, when Singapore left the federation, right, the seats from Singapore were not redistributed to Sabah and Sarawak, and therefore Sabah and Sarawak ended up with only 25% of the seats in parliament. So the Sabahans and Sarawakians are making the argument that since Singapore was part of the original deal, once they left, those seats should be redistributed to Sabah and Sarawak, and we should hold 1/3. In other words, we will act as sort of the emergency stop if something goes wrong. So that is the argument. There's a lot of argument among the decision makers now about how this 1/3 should look like. There are lots of people against this, including some people in this room who are against giving Sabah and Sarawak 1/3. They talk about changing the numbers. You know, in the lower house, we keep the same formula, but maybe we give them the 1/3 at the upper house at the Senate level. But again, as I said, there was a lot of argument. People are still talking about this. But I can assure you the general theme of having 1/3 is something that is very strong among the political elites of Sabah and Sarawak. Secondly, they want executive control over health and education. Most people do not know that if you read the Malaysia Agreement carefully, right, Sabah and Sarawak at the time of the formation never gave the federal government full control over education. They said that the federal government can control education subject to the needs of Sabah and Sarawak. And therefore, because of that, right, they want to renegotiate with the federal government and say that because of the special needs we have in Sabah and Sarawak, we want to take executive control over health and education. The Federal Ministry of Health and Education can still exist, but in Sabah and Sarawak, it will basically be run through Kota Kinabalu and Kuching. I just want to share with you an example of the problems they face in Sarawak in education. A lot of the rural schools in Sarawak are actually falling down, or they don't have proper buildings and everything. The problem is that because the decision on repairs, everything is made at the federal level, right? It's very difficult once the contract is issued in Kuala Lumpur for the people in Sabah and Sarawak to pick up the contract. As you know, right, the way it works in Malaysia is that once you get a government-funded project, say to build a new school building, everything, right, the federal government actually doesn't pay you. They pay in stages. So what the contractor do is that every time they need to collect their partial payment, they're forced to fly to Kuala Lumpur to the MOF here in Putrajaya to ask for the money. So they're saying that this is creating a lot of hassle. And also in Sarawak, you have a special problem with NCR land. These are land without titles. Some of these schools are built on NCR land. So because there's no clean title, the federal government refused to fund any repairs or to upgrade the schools. So these are very specific Sarawak problems which cannot be resolved at the federal level. So they're saying that we need to bring executive control back to the state capitals of Kota Kinabalu and Kuching. The other thing they want to talk about, and I think they're quite serious, that they want to take back control of the continental shelves. So the argument is that before Malaysia, the continental shelf was actually owned by Sabah and Sarawak, mostly Sarawak, and therefore after Malaysia, you actually cannot change. You cannot change on this side. Suddenly said that the continental shelf belongs to the Federation of Malaysia. Now, in terms of oil and gas, I mentioned just now under PDA 1974, the federal government owns everything. So I do not think at a practical level, the state government of Sabah Sarawak is going to push to review the PDA 74 for all sorts of reasons I can't go in, but basically legally it's very difficult to go back to PDA 74. But what they want is going forward, they want the oil and gas industries in those individual states will be subcontract out from Petronas to the state-level oil companies. So Sabah and Sarawak have actually established their own oil companies. In Sarawak, it's called Petros, and in Sabah, it's called SMJ Petroleum. So they're saying that anything that deals with oil and gas in those two states, please subcontract the work or give us the authority to take over the stuff happening on the ground in Sabah and Sarawak, especially on the retail part. Okay. They also want more representation in federal bodies, especially in GLC. So for example, until very recently, Sabahans and Sarawakians were always complaining that there is no representative from those two states. For example, in the Lembaga Hasil Dalam, the income tax department at the board level. They recently appointed somebody there, but this is the sort of thing we're talking about. At very high level federal government bodies, some of them are actually missing representation from East Malaysia. Okay. I've mentioned about autonomy from MOF in terms of federal projects. The one item that is unique to Sabah is that in the Malaysia agreement, it states very clearly that Sabah is supposed to receive back 40% of all the revenues raised by the federal government. So this one, my understanding is that the federal government and the Sabah government have already worked out a formula. It's a question of implementing it. But I understand there's also some problems with implementing it because apparently there is now some political disagreements on some very, very specific parts of it. A lot of it has got to do with how you calculate the 40%. But basically, Sabahans expect the federal government to pay back this 40%. And the amount we're talking about is not a small amount because it dates back all the way from the 1970s. And of course, goes without saying, they want MA63 to be fully implemented now that you've passed the Constitution Amendment. Now, before I finish on this page, I need to mention that there's also a small group in both Sabah and Sarawak who believe that in terms of what Sabahans and Sarawakians want is that we want this whole MA63 thing to be scrapped because Malaya never kept to its any promises. We are poor compared to our counterparts in Malaya, and that no matter what the federal government do going forward, right, they're just not going to be able to resolve this autonomy thing. So let's invalidate it. So for example, right, they have tried to file court cases. A group in Sarawak recently filed a court case to invalidate MA63, and the Sabah Law Society, a statutory body, has filed a court case against the federal government over the 40%. There are groups out there who think that the Federation of Malaysia has not succeeded, and that the best way is to get out of the federation. And of course, they always want to use the example of Singapore, how Singapore became a very successful country after leaving the federation. So I suppose this leads us to the next part of discussion. Will Sabah and Sarawak get what it wants? Based on the list I just presented just now. This is where it gets really interesting, because in order to get what you want, because a lot of the items I've just described are political in nature, you cannot have a strong federal government. Remember, right, when the Barisan Nasional was very strong, they ignored the Sabahans and the Sarawakians. Now, linked to this is, of course, you cannot have a united Malay political class in Malaya. Right now, all the sort of problems that we see here on this side is because the Malay political class is highly divided. If the Malay political class is very united, very strong, you have a strong federal government, you really can't deal with what they want in Sabah and Sarawak. Therefore, if there's political instability, right, you can have a strong federal government. The problem is Sabah and Sarawak cannot avoid any political fallout. As I mentioned, if you see the political fallout from 2020, the fall of government, 2021, and of course 2022, all of them were looking towards Sabah and Sarawak in terms of numbers game. So Sabah and Sarawak cannot escape from the political fallout. But at the same time, you do not want a strong federal government because it means that you can ignore the wishes of Sabah and Sarawak. My take is that, by and large, Sarawak will end up with the highest level of political autonomy in the system in the coming years, simply because GPS is highly united on the Sarawak side, and they have a large chunk of MPs. If they can combine and create a thing known as the Borneo Bloc with GRS, in fact, GRS is looking towards the GPS as a political model. If they can come together, there's altogether 57 seats from Sabah and Sarawak. Say if they can come together as a bloc, say controlling at least 40 seats, I think they will be a major power. And it is not possible in terms of doing any major political issues in Malaysia without consulting Sabah and Sarawak. So what are the political implications of what I've just described? The rise of Sabah and Sarawak. I think one way of looking at the political implications is to understand what is happening since the general elections of 2022. It is my argument now that this country is really highly polarized. So basically you have three visions of what Malaysia should be. Obviously, you have the vision of the conservative Malay class here who believe that this is a Malay state, Ketuanan Melayu Islam, a Malay Islamic state. And of course, the best spokesperson for this is the recent statements put up by Tun Dr. Mahathir. So that is one clear vision for Malaysia. And that vision is basically what Malaysia has been about for the last 50 years, essentially UMNO vision. Then you have the second big vision, and that is the vision of a quasi-Malay Islamic state slowly moves towards a full Malay Islamic state. And that is the vision provided by PAS and its supporters, right? Then you have the third vision. The third vision is basically, the vision from Sabah and Sarawak, right? Which, as I mentioned, is totally totally different from what you have on this side. So the question is that, can these three versions actually come together? Because it seems to me, right, there is very little space in between. So you got one group here who believe that this country is a Malay state. You got another group who believes that, this country should be more secular, more progressive, more modern. And then you've got the people from Sabah and Sarawak promoting another vision of Malaysia. Now, the reason why I say it's highly polarized and that there's no common ground is because if you look at the parliament today, right, you can see, right, the biggest bloc is the Islamic bloc, PAS, which, as I said, go for Ketuanan Melayu Islam. The second biggest bloc is DAP, which goes for, I don't want to use the word secular, but more progressive, modern Malaysia with some elements of secularism as understood in the Malaysian context, which is that Islam is the religion of federation, but every other faith is protected and you can practice your faith easily. Then you got your third block, the Sabah and Sarawak block, which is the third vision, right? So my point is that these three are due to clash sooner or later. You can't avoid that clash. Then you have this thing about the Malay elites. How do you reconcile? Because interestingly enough, Sabah being a Muslim majority state now, there are people in Sabah pushing very strongly for, interestingly enough, for Ketuanan Melayu in Sabah as well. Okay? Now, one of the interesting things I've been hearing, right, in the past few months is that people argue that maybe Sabah and Sarawak act as a bulwark against political Islam. They're saying that maybe we should look towards Sabah and Sarawak as the vision of a multicultural Malaysia. But my argument is that that is probably something that will only occur if there's a political crisis staring at us in the face. But we're also looking at, in terms of political implications, we're also looking at long-term changes to the federal-state relationship or the nature of federal system in Malaysia. Some argue that we could be heading to a two-tier federal system, which is that the federal-state relationship between Sabah and Sarawak as Wilayah will be different from the federal and state relationship with the other 11 states in the peninsula. But this is really, really problematic. How do you strike the right balance? Because we also know on this side, states with strong identity like Kelantan and Johor are already complaining that all these special deals with Sabah and Sarawak should be extended to them. Okay? And of course, the issue is that if Malaya decided to pursue this strong Ketuhanan Melayu Islam state, right, what will Sabah and Sarawak do? So in terms of the lessons, I think it's quite clear that historical grievances can be found in many parts of Malaysia, not only in Sabah and Sarawak, but Sabah and Sarawak is probably, unique. The reason why it's very unique is because when you look at it, right, there's really nothing to connect Sabah and Sarawak to Malaya. I think people often forget this point, right? Prior to 63, they had a totally different demography over there. The Malays are absolute minorities in Sabah and Sarawak, and even the Malays, people who call themselves Malays in Sabah and Sarawak, don't trace their ancestry to the Malays of Malaya. They have totally different set of customs, they have totally different set of religion, language, and history, completely different. We know that Sabah or North Borneo was ruled by a private company. Sarawak was, of course, the land of the white Rajas. So there was really nothing in common. They were all brought together and forced to assimilate because of because the British wanted to create a federation in this part of the world. Okay? So in terms of assimilation, the export of the Malayan political model to Sabah and Sarawak, I'll argue that they've been much more successful in Sabah because they managed to change the demography. I think one of the things they never expect was the strong pushback by the native non-Muslim community from both Sabah and Sarawak. Okay? You can argue in terms of social science, you can argue that what is happening in Sabah and Sarawak was bound to happen, especially if you use the path-dependent thesis. A lot of the decisions made by the political leaders at the federal level in the late 60s and early 70s, especially late 70s, have led us to what we have today. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, historical grievances is not only found in many parts of Malaysia, but it's actually part of the colonial legacy in Southeast Asia. So you look at Indonesia, there are many regional parts of Indonesia that are very unhappy. You look at southern Thailand, you look at the Mindanao region in the Philippines. They're all suffering from historical grievances. So in conclusion, the issue of historical grievances relating to Sabah and Sarawak and the issue of state nationalism has become a permanent feature of Sabah and Sarawak politics. If you want to lose an election in Sabah and Sarawak, just say that you are pro-federal. I guarantee that you will lose you will lose election. Most probably you even lose your deposit as well. So the political culture in both states now is all about fighting for our rights. So the rights is often not defined, but all the major parties, whether you're in the government or the opposition, they always say, we're going to fight for our rights. Okay? The other general feeling in Sabah and Sarawak is that while the race and racial thing on this side is getting worse, Malay is heading towards key, they're very conscious of the fact that they should not follow the Malayan model because it has not worked. It has led to more and more polarization. So the approach taken by the political elites in Sabah and Sarawak, whether they can do it or not is a separate issue, but the thinking is that we need to create a state within a state. We want to be separate but equal. So you can see in terms of Sarawak, right, everything is Sarawak first. They're sort of building a state within the states. So my final comment is that we live in interesting times. Thank you very much. I'll take Q&A.
Thanks, James, for an enlightening, I would say, an update and also a reality check on what's going on in Sabah, Sarawak, and how Malaysia is heading towards this new future. So now we're going to take some Q&A from the audience. Anyone raise your hand? Okay, the lady behind you, Walid, then Hok On. Right.
Thank you, Prof. James, for your enlightening speech. My first question is, you mentioned before, just now about the setting of the multicultural in Malaysia is actually following what happened in Venezuela, Malaysia, right? So in your opinion, as Sarawakian, what do you think the best formula to acknowledge the native in Sabah and Sarawak? Okay, so that's first question. Second question, then, if you mentioned just now that if the Malaysian, the federal government more conservative and Islamic, taking more Islamic approach, and you said that there is a possibility that the Sabah and Sarawak will withdraw. Considering that withdrawing from the federal. So what do you think about this thing as the Sarawakian? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your question. I'll wear my Sarawak hat from now on. So your first question about multicultural setting, what I actually said was that I said that because people can see that multicultural setting works in Sabah and Sarawak, the people from the Malayan side are thinking that Sabah and Sarawak in some ways represent the old Malaya, right? If you speak to old people, right, they always say that, oh, in the old days, when we were growing up, when we were studying, race was never an issue. Everybody was given enough space, whether you're Muslim or non-Muslim, that was really not an issue. We could sit down in the same kopitiam, all those things. So they're saying that, we can still see this thing happening in Sabah and Sarawak. So if you go to a kopitiam in Kuching and kopitiam in Sabah, right, within the same kopitiam, there are Muslim and non-Muslim stores selling food together. I don't think you can find those stuff in Kuala Lumpur anymore. So what I'm talking about is that what is happening in Sabah and Sarawak has sort of given the people on this side this thinking that yes, multiculturalism can work in the Malaysian setting. So in terms of your question about whether the push for Islamization will lead to successionist movement in Sabah and Sarawak, it depends on the nature of the push. I think the people, the political elites in Sabah and Sarawak have a very high tolerance level. If you were to impose that sort of Islamic framework in Malaya side and don't really push it all the way to Sabah and Sarawak, I think they're quite willing to live with it. I think the problem starts is when you try to export that to Sabah and Sarawak and push very hard. So for example, if you speak to Sabahans, right, they keep reminding, they're very angry about it that one of their previous Chief Minister, Mustafa Harun, actually changed the constitution of the Sabah constitution to make Islam the religion of Sabah, when it was quite clear when they signed up in '63 that there was not supposed to be a state religion. So things like that get them very, very angry. So it's a question of how much pushing you're doing and whether you force it upon them. So we are still very far from that part, because my understanding is that even among the Dakwah groups in Sabah and Sarawak, they actually they try to convert the native population, but the way they do it over in Sabah and Sarawak is very different from the way they do it over here in Peninsular Malaysia.
Next question by Walid.
Hi, Prof. Chin. Thank you so much. My question is, how credible are the local political elites among the local constituents? Because it seems that after decades of failure to deliver, why would they still be taken seriously, or are they at all? And when you say what those Sabahans and Sarawakians want, how do you disaggregate between what the elites are saying and what people are actually saying, or are the two congruent?
Thank you very much for that question. So you're quite right. The problem is once you play the rhetoric of fighting for our rights, MA63, all these things, right? That thing can be used to cover all the other issues. It's just like on this side, once you play the race and religion card, right? Even though it contradicts some of your earlier positions, it doesn't matter. It can, sort of sweep through all the other issues. You are right in a sense that the political elites of Sabah and Sarawak has really not delivered, but it really doesn't matter, because elections there are not about, the real democratic process of choosing the best candidate. Elections in Sabah and Sarawak is all about vote buying. It's all about what sort of machinery you can put together. It's all about how you can control the rural population, how you can pull out your supporters, logistic, all that sort of thing. So the sort of elections we see in Sabah and Sarawak, the process itself is probably fair. Nobody forces you to vote anyway, but in between you going to the polling booth, all sorts of things can happen. We know in Sabah and Sarawak, the most important thing that happens during election is that on polling day, the night before, it always rains. It rains with money. So.
All right, Hawk on. Then after that.
This is being recorded, right? This is something I heard. I've never seen it.
Thank
okay,
you.
which was something. Hawk on.
Right, thanks, James. The first item of the demands was the 1/3 of Parliament seats. My question is how convicted and insistent are Sabah and Sarawak about it? Just put it into context. Also, you know, in terms of the negotiations that will be ensuing in 2024 when Malaysia will be due for 26, sorry, for redelineation. It wasn't really Pakatan's very uniform promise as well, as I understand it. It was DAP's intervention and specifically Lim Guan Eng's insistence about the 1/3 promise. And on the Sabah Sarawak side, what GPS, their pledge was just to abide with the original spirit of MA 63, not specifying 1/3. So, you know, is there room for negotiation? I mean, how do you see that proceeding on a very, very crucial matter for Malaysia, the first proper redelineation federally since 2003? Another question, if I could tag on, is they have the numbers, the leverage, but yet there's also this indecisiveness and this deference. So how do you explain this? I mean, is it strategic that they go from, oh, we'll follow BN, oh, and then we'll go with the wishes of the Agong instead of just really seizing the moment and asserting, you know, themselves? I mean, do they just think that, okay, we'll go with the flow because they know that they can get what they want, or is there still other reason? Is there something deeper to this seeming, you know, fickleness?
Thank you, Hok Wang, for those questions. I'll answer your second question first. The reality is that the political elites in Sabah, they actually don't care who forms the federal government. They just want to be part of the federal government. So they will go with the herd. So when it was quite clear that Anwar Ibrahim was asked by the Agong to form the government, so they immediately switched. But to be fair to them, that was a popular switch because the Christian community in Sarawak put tremendous pressure on them to switch because they were afraid of past Islamic state thing. So, but in general, the elites in Sabah and Sarawak, right, when it comes to the formation of the government, there's no ideological things involved, there's no hindrance, there's nothing. Whoever forms the government, we just want to be part of the government because we want to bring resources back to Sabah and Sarawak and hopefully get additional concessions. Your very important question of 1/3, I don't want to say anything in public other than a comment that everything on the future of the 1/3 will be dependent on whether Anwar Ibrahim can stay in power. Okay, whether Anwar Ibrahim can stay in power. I think there is a consensus among the Sarawak elites on what the 1/3 should look like. My understanding is that there is no consensus yet in Sabah on what the 1/3 should look like. Like I said, there are various models being floated around on how you can sort of give Sabahans and Sarawakians sort of a block in Parliament over the Constitution Amendment issues. But everything is riding on whether Anwar Ibrahim can stay in power, because if the other side comes in, their outlook is very, very different. So that's the reason why, you know, if this conference was about the upcoming 6th election, we have doubled the number in the audience.
All right, thank you for that. Chin Huat will be next.
I think you have to be the last person.
Thank you. Good morning. I have two questions. The first is, Sabah and Sarawakian have been arguing for decentralization, something exclusive to their states. The idea behind that is like, if you're going to involve the 11 states in Malaya, then we become just one of the 13. There's one tricky part of that. If decentralization is just going to benefit Sabah and Sarawak, why should Peninsular politicians support that? They would do that only when they are threatened. So they do it as lip service. Whenever they can avoid fulfilling it, they would avoid. That's basically where it's stuck. Do you think it would be more strategic for Sabah and Sarawak to advocate decentralization across Malaysia, meaning to give the Peninsular states some benefit in pushing for a nationwide decentralization, while Sabah and Sarawak get more than others. My second question is, in response to Mahathir's outbursts against this multi-ethnic nation, UPCO former President Wilfred Matius Tangau has openly called Mahathir a Malayan colonialist and imperialist because ultimately Malaysia was a union of 4 countries, and you cannot accept that basically you assume that Sabah and Sarawak are just appendixes to Malaya, Tanah Melayu. Do you think his strong statement is shared by other East Malaysians? Thank you.
Okay. Your first question is an interesting question. I don't have any position on that, on whether the decentralization process, if given the Sabah and Sarawak, maybe all or maybe a portion of that can be extended to the states of Malaya. I actually don't have any positions on that. Your second question on Wilfred, I think the sentiment in Sabah is that I think they support the general gist of the statement, which is that Sabahans and Sarawakians sign out for a multicultural Malaysia. They never sign out for a Tanah Melayu. I think that sort of a summary is something they support. To be honest with you, I think the majority of Sabah and Sarawakians only, just like most of us when we do social media, we just read the headline. We don't go into the details. But I think there is a lot of unhappiness in Sabah and Sarawak with the statements backed by Mahathir. But in general, right, the thing to remember is that Mahathir has always been extremely unpopular in Sabah because of Project IC. A lot of my Sabahan friends who I've known for many years were utterly shocked. They told me they were utterly shocked when during the RCI hearing on this issue, Mahathir keeps saying he cannot remember. A lot of people were utterly shocked because they thought that he would put out a big defense, but his defense was that he cannot remember anything. But then after the RCI was finished, he could remember a lot of the stuff.
It's 9:30, and I apologize for cutting short the question, and Jack Go and Bridget had a question. So, because we have a 10 o'clock first session, so now is the morning tea break. So, I thank James for his talk and for his answering questions as much as he can. Feel free to catch him after the session to ask your question directly to him. Now, there's tea being prepared on the side. Now, just a little gentle reminder, try to budget for others. I know, because we're going to have a very good lunch, right? And as you can see from our bellies, it's quite heavy. We still have digesting yesterday. I think Wilbert is having a big problem walking home yesterday. So please give a big hand to James again. And for your questions, I thank you all. And please enjoy the tea. And by 10 o'clock, help yourself to the different panel sessions. First session here, rest on the other side like yesterday. Thank you very much.
Can you ask the girl to take a picture of this?
Oh, take you, then I'll take you.
Yeah.
No.